It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Isla Myers-Smith to our Faculty of Forestry Research Seminar. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us today and give a brief introduction before Isla gets started. Isla is currently in Edinburgh, Scotland, where she is a Chancellor's Fellow, Senior Lecturer. So that's like being an Associate Professor here at UBC in the School of Geosciences. And Isla started out her academic journey with her bachelor's degree in agroecology from UBC in the land and food systems, what is now land and food systems. And then she went on to do her master's at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and then her PhD at the University of Alberta. And her master's and PhD put her work squarely into Arctic and northern ecosystems. She then did postdocs at the Université de Sherbrooke with Mark Velland at UBC in the Department of Geography, and then she moved on to her current position at the University of Edinburgh. Her work has been really widely recognized. Just in recent years, in 2021, National Geographic named her one of 26 change makers of 2021. And earlier, she was made a National Geographic Explorer. And she also won the Royal Geographic Society's Walters Kundert Fellowship in 2018. Wired magazine named her one of 25 tech and science innovators in 2020. And she has other awards, including the Canadian Society for Ecology and Evolution's Early Career Award. In addition to doing research in the Arctic, Isla teaches an online, massive open online course in coding, and she's reached out to, I believe, hundreds of thousands of students around the world. Something like 700,000 people have participated in that coding course. So with that, I would like to turn things over to Isla, and I'm looking forward to hearing about Tundra and Boreal ecosystem responses to climate change.
Thanks so much, Sally. So I will launch in here. If there's any technical difficulties, just let me know. So for the talk today, thanks very much for the invitation. What I wanted to do was kind of capitalize on the fact that last week on Monday, the IPCC reports, the Working Group 2 report, the impacts report was published. And so with this talk, I'm going to go through some of the different ecosystem responses to the warming climate in the Arctic, in the tundra and boreal ecosystems, and think specifically about what's in those reports, what the evidence for the different findings are of the report, and what the kind of key unknowns are that we still need to figure out. And I wanted to start the talk off with acknowledging the fact that my own field research happens in the Canadian Arctic and in the territory of the Inuvialuit people and also the Kluane First Nation in the southern Yukon. But today I'm going to be presenting a little bit about this work in the Canadian Arctic, but also about data sets that come from around the Arctic from different peoples and places. So this is very much a collaborative talk, and this research is very collaborative, both with different research teams, but with local people in the Arctic. And this is a photograph of myself, a couple of my students, and two of the park rangers on Kikiktarik Herschel Island, which is a territorial park up on the Arctic coast of the Yukon. And we'll talk a little bit more about that site as we go through the talk. And I want to emphasize the fact that the research that I'm presenting for you today is very collaborative too. So I have different what we call them data presence across the talk, and some of these have been produced by different members of my team or different close collaborators, and you'll see the photograph and the name of those people as we get to those slides. And I wanted to start with thinking about the Arctic. So this is looking down on the top of our planet and looking at that snowy version of the terrestrial part of the Arctic. So we've taken out the sea ice here, but you can see the Arctic is very much shaped by the cold, snowy, icy environment that is very dominant in the wintertime. Can you hear me now? When we're thinking about the Arctic and climate change and how that might play out across these vast ecosystems, I want to talk to you a little bit about what being in transition might mean. And so I'm showing this image here where you can see forest fires in a forested Arctic landscape, somewhere close to tree line in Russia. And so when we're thinking about this Arctic in transition because of warming, there are many different processes at play. And today I'm not going to talk about forest fires, but I'm going to give you hopefully a pretty clear picture of what's happening on the vegetation end of that story. So one of the big vegetation changes up north that's quite prominent in our understanding of Arctic climate change responses is movement of tree line northward. But in this talk, I'm going to focus you a little bit away from the trees. I know you're a forestry faculty, but let's think more about other woody species in the system. Let's think about the shrubs. And I will sort of make the argument, perhaps across this talk, that shrubs are the trees of the tundra, and they're really key players in the change that's going on with climate change in these systems. So, yeah, just almost 2 weeks ago, the IPCC Working Group 2 reports came out, and they're available to read now, all 3,000 plus pages. Check them out for sure. And I was able to contribute to chapter 2 of the full report, the one on vegetation. And of course, throughout the whole report, the sort of very strong theme is warming and what the impacts of that warming are for the entire planet. And through the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus in on the Arctic and the terrestrial part of the Arctic. And I'm going to highlight the different changes that are mentioned within the IPCC reports with respect to Arctic tundra ecosystems. And occasionally I'll include the actual quotes from the reports with the wording that they're using. But I'll give you my perspective on the change that's going on as well. So if we go back to looking at a circumpolar view of the Arctic, you can see this is a color image here showing the amount of warming and where that's happening. This is the warming that happened last year within the Arctic. And you can see the yellow dot there. That's one of our focal research sites in my research group, Qikqtarjuaq. And so you've got a lot of warming and a lot of warming happening towards the poles that's causing these ecosystems to transition. And I wanted to give a sort of global perspective before we zoom too deep into the Arctic here. And so these are sort of interesting plots here where you can look at the amount of warming that's going on as a sort of topographical feature of these globes from different angles looking on the planet. And you can see everywhere there's kind of this mountain of warming up at the high latitudes. And if you look at change over time in temperatures across the last 100 years or so, you've got the gray line there is the global change in temperatures, and you can see the warming happening there. And the red line is the Arctic climate change. And when I started my career, we used to use the phrase that the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the Arctic or the rest of the world. And in fact, I was still using that kind of phrasing about 1 or 2 years ago. But then there were some updated reports that came out last year, and those reports started to suggest that we should be using 3 times the warming of the rate of the rest of the planet for the Arctic. And then in December of last year, some more research has been coming out and suggesting now we need to switch to 4 times. So within the last year, many of us Arctic scientists have gone from saying 2 times to 3 times to 3 to 4 times now. So the rate of change, of climate change in the Arctic is rapid, and that rate of change is more rapid than anywhere else on the planet. And so that's the current climate change that's already happened. But one of the sort of main aims of the IPCC reports is to get us to think forward to what might be happening in the future. So this is a projection for the Northern Hemisphere of warming through to the 2100. And so this is for the Northern Hemisphere. But let's look at the Arctic. So a much greater rate of warming. And we can put the 2 together and you can see that in the Arctic, we're talking about 8 degrees more warming than what we would see for the planet as a whole, given these scenarios projected here. So how are plants responding to that warming? The IPCC reports overall say that warming at high latitudes is continuing to alter tundra plant communities, and we have fairly strong evidence for that and a high agreement. So what is that evidence? And if plants are changing on the ground, what does that mean from what we see in terms of observations from space. So in the IPCC reports, they say in the Arctic, permafrost thaw and snowfall decrease are leading to an overall greening of tundra, and both greening and browning of tundra and boreal forests. And again, we have relatively high confidence in this. And a lot of my work at the moment with my research group thinks about these different perspectives we have on this change. So from the ground, from this picture here, which is a drone's eye view of the tundra landscapes on Qikqtarjuaq. You can see a little herd of muskox there, up to what satellites are seeing. But in the talk today, I'm going to really focus in on what's happening on the ground, sort of boots on the ground science, and what we can figure out from these data sets. So there's Qikqtarjuaq again from a sort of global perspective, and this is a map of biodiversity data sets around the world. And if you can sort of squint, you can see there are places on the planet that we don't do as good of a job of monitoring, and one of those places is the Arctic. So one of the goals of my research and that of my collaborators is to fill in those data gaps and knowledge gaps for Arctic and boreal ecosystems. And one of the themes I want to talk about in the talk today is the concept of seasonality and this question of how seasonality is shifting within the Arctic as things warm. It was one of the big themes, I would say, of the IPCC reports that came out. And there's strong implications for many different parts of these ecosystems. So I wanted to start off with the way we tend to think about seasonality in our lives. So we divide up the year into these different months, and then we have our 4 seasons: winter, spring, summer, and autumn, or fall. But I don't know that those seasons really capture what's going on in Arctic ecosystems. So we'll keep the months there for your orientation. One of the really big things that structures life and everything within Arctic and high latitude systems is the sort of change in solar inputs into the system. So you've got sort of 2 extremes: the polar night, where you have no sunlight at all, and the period of midnight sun in the summer, where the sun never sets. In these Arctic ecosystems, you also have this really strong transition from things being completely frozen to the systems being open water systems, thawed systems. And that transition from frozen to thawed is influenced by heat and solar input, but it's offset from the light conditions to a certain extent. So if you put the freeze, thaw sort of patterns and the sunlight patterns, you actually get 6 seasons in high latitude ecosystems. And that's the way that Inuvialuit and Inuit people and other Arctic peoples have thought about seasonality for immemorial time. And so I wonder if we shouldn't shift in IPCC reports and in the way we do our science, our thinking about seasonality too. But I think the sort of key take-home message when you're thinking about seasonality in the Arctic and climate change in the Arctic is really what drives all of the patterns, the cycles of life, and the change that we see is this transition from frozen to thawed, and when it happens within the year, and what's happening over time as the climate warms. And so this is a picture of a retrogressive thaw slump, a permafrost thaw slump feature on Qikqtarjuaq. And sort of quoting again from the IPCC reports, with disturbances like this and at larger scales, permafrost thaw in general, we're approaching a sort of state of irreversibility with some of these changes, at least on sort of human generational timescales, where we can't return this landscape to what it looked like before the permafrost thaw started thawing. So just to give you a feel, this retrogressive thaw slump is about 2 kilometers across, and it's growing back many meters each year. And I haven't seen it since 2019, so I'm hopefully going to get to go back this summer and see what it looks like now. So in this section of the talk, I want to think about that concept of phenology, so the timing of life events and how that's being changed by climate change. So this is a video of the Arctic growing season up on Qikqtarjuaq. And just in general in the Arctic, the growing season length, summer is about 6 to 8 weeks. And you can see just with that video, obviously sped up a little bit, how quickly you can go from the start of the growing season through flowering through to the senescence of tundra. And so we can use those timing of plant events like leaves opening up, flowers, leaves turning yellow, to track the change in the timing of how plants grow and how they reproduce over time. So these are data from the Kikitark site collected across the long-term monitoring program there by the park rangers. And that's what we were doing in that first photograph. We were checking out these plant plots. And what you can see here is that on the y-axis, you have the day of the year, and you've got time on the x-axis. So the relationship is kind of going down, which is that plant phenology, in this case, flowering of a species called Salix arctica. It's getting earlier with time. And there's also variation, interannual variation. So some years it's particularly early, like 2015. And some years it's much later, more typical to how it was in the past, like in 2018. And so I wanted to highlight the research of someone who I think I saw popping into the audience here, and that's Courtney Collins, who's a biodiversity postdoc at UBC at the moment and worked with me over the last couple of years in collaboration. Well, she was working at University of Boulder, Colorado with Sarah Elmendorf, and I was a collaborator on this project. And what Courtney was looking at was experimental warming responses of plant phenology across the tundra biome. So working with a data set compiled by the International Tundra Experiment Collaboration Group, where these open top chambers, there's a little diagram of one there, were put down over the tundra. And then over time, we monitored what happened to those plants as they were passively warmed and in the control plots. And what Courtney found was this shift in the growing season with warming. So the growing season, all these different phenological stages of all these different species shifted earlier, but the different phenological phases shifted by different amounts. And so this, I think, was a really cool study and is giving us insight into the kind of changes that might be going on over time. But we haven't yet done the temporal analysis. So that's one of the things I hope to be working on with these collaborators in the coming years. And I wanted to briefly present a sort of another take on the phenology question. And I know it's something that people in the Faculty of Forestry are interested in too. This is a more modest experiment than the ones that you guys have, but we decided to set up a common garden experiment with some of these tundra shrubs in the Yukon. So we collected the same species from the Arctic coast of the Yukon and in the Alpine, and we brought them together in a common boreal forest environment. And we look at a variety of different factors, but here this is a sort of time lapse of growth over the growing season. And in the foreground, you've got an Arctic willow. In the background, you have the alpine willows. And you can see what starts to happen when you move these willows well out of their range into a different solar environment. The poor little Arctic willow there is senescing in the middle of July when it should be still growing. And the alpine willows in the back are happy and green still. So I think there's lots of really interesting questions about what drives variation in plant phenology, how much local adaptation there is in these phenological responses. And these are questions that I'd like to put together with some of that synthetic work we can do with experiments and observations. But one of the challenges with phenology data in the Arctic is that we have sort of some data gaps. So in the International Tundra Experiment database, we have about 12 sites with spring green up phenology data. We have around 18 sites with flowering phenology data in midsummer, but only 10 sites with autumn phenology data. And to understand the full plant responses to climate warming, we really need to capture the full growing season and be able to figure out how growing season length is changing. So one of the really key things is to capture that senescence period of the year. And so we just got a new project funded in my research group where we're going to set out to try and fill in some of those data gaps temporally across the growing season, and particularly targeting those late season senescence phenophases. And one of the easy ways, or easy-ish ways to get at that, is using time-lapse photography. So there are some existing phenocams set up at different Arctic sites, but we want to expand that network so that we have a record of phenological change across the growing season, across multiple years, where we're capturing every part of the growing season with photographs taken every hour. And that will give us a really detailed impression of how these plants are responding to variation in climate across the growing season from year to year, and it'll help us make a more informed understanding of how plant phenology is going to change in the future. So the take home from this section of the talk, coming out of the IPCC reports and with the bit of information that I provided to you in the talk, is that tundra plant phenology is shifting earlier at many sites, but changes across the growing season are less clear often because we have data gaps at particular points in the season, because we can't always have boots on the ground researchers capturing each of those key phenological stages at these different monitoring sites. So in the next section of the talk, I want to chat a bit more about how tundra plant communities are changing. And so this is again our Qikiqtarjuq site, and I think I'm setting up a phenocam in the background. And so one of the biggest changes that's going on in Arctic ecosystems, and this was very prominent within the IPCC reports back in the last round in 2014 and this year, and this is the process of shrubification. So we have very robust evidence and high agreement in that evidence that climate warming is causing an increase in shrubs in tundra ecosystems and also in other ecosystems around the planet. And these are two photographs from the Qikiqtarjuq site from 1986 and 2019, showing the transition of this floodplain area from a not super shrubby place to a very shrubby place. And so if you look across the tundra biome, and again, working with the International Tundra Experiment dataset, you can see one of the most strong signals within the analyses of those data are an increase in shrubs and a decrease in bare ground. And the other sort of line of evidence that we know that shrubs would be likely to responding as the climate warms is we have pretty strong evidence that their growth is climate sensitive. So this is a dendroecological analysis that I did a few years back, and we've been building on it in different ways, looking at the interannual variation in growth of shrubs using their growth rings and linking that to different climate variables. And the sort of common signal that we find across these analyses is that summer temperatures are the variable to which they're most responsive. So as the temperatures warm, we see wider growth rings. But we see other patterns too, like soil moisture. You get stronger temperature sensitivity in wetter sites versus drier sites. We see implications of snowmelt timing and phenology, herbivory, et cetera, on the growth of shrubs. And when we look across the Arctic, we see this shrubification signal is very widespread. So these are a review of different lines of evidence for shrubification around the Arctic, and all the green dots are the places where shrubs are increasing in cover. The brown dots are places where we see decreases in shrub cover, which can happen at sites, sometimes due to flooding or strong herbivory pressure. And then the X's are places where there's more stable shrub cover. But the overall signal is often an increase in shrubs. And I alluded to the fact that this is going on in other biomes as well. And one of my PhD students did a cross biome comparison of shrubification going on in the Arctic and woody plant encroachment in savannas. And there's a lot of similarities between the processes at play, but the climate drivers are different. It's precipitation in savannas and temperature in the tundra. So I wanted to get you guys to think a little bit about the traits of different tundra species. And so again, we'll start with a global perspective to launch in. So this is a figure of global trait space. So each dot is a plant species and where it sits within an ordination of multiple different of the best measured plant traits. So you can consider this sort of like the spectrum of global trait space. And so one of the questions when we started working and thinking about a trait perspective in tundra ecosystems that we had was, how much of global trait space do tundra plants occupy? So the first thing we need to do was compile a data set so we could test this question, and that was a few years in the making. And then we could, and here's what we found. Tundra plants make up about half of global trait space. And relatively obviously that sort of the tundra part is the part where the plants are shorter versus taller. But what was interesting to us is that the different sort of strategies that plants can use to acquire resources, from being sort of slow growing and conservative to fast growing and making use of resources, seems to be pretty much occupied by tundra plants. So they use all the different techniques for making use of their environment, just like plants all around the planet. And so then we wanted to ask with that data set, how are traits changing in these tundra plant communities? And we looked at a bunch of these really well-measured traits across these plant communities, across the Arctic. And what we found was that plant height in particular was increasing over time, and other traits didn't show a strong directionality as of yet. And that's quite consistent with our observation of shrubification, the tall plants in these systems. So take home from this section at the top, pretty straightforward. Tundra plant communities are getting taller and shrubbier. So now I wanted to dip into the topic of biodiversity change a bit and think about how that might be responding with warming. So across the tundra biome, there is a latitudinal gradient in the species richness of plant communities. It's not as strong as you might think, and there's a surprising biodiversity in quite high latitude tundra ecosystems, but there is a bit of a decrease as you move with latitude across the tundra biome. But one of the questions that we had is, how does the functional diversity, so functional diversity being a sort of common metric of all the traits represented within individual plant communities, how does that vary across latitudinal gradients? And what we found with functional richness is a bit of a sort of spread at the lower latitudes in alpine tundra, but in general, not a strong latitudinal gradient. And then we wanted to think about change in functional richness over time and what might be driving that. And these are analyses that are very much going on at the moment. We were putting this plot together today. And what we've been finding is there's a bit of a signal of, as you have a change in shrub cover, so either an increase or decrease, that corresponds with a change in functional richness. So these patterns in functional richness, that sort of trait level biodiversity metric of these tundra plant communities, seems to be driven by changes in the shrubs. So going back to just species richness as a biodiversity metric, what are we seeing in terms of change over time? In general, if you statistically model it, the models aren't significant. So you can see the credible intervals of this model overlap 0, but there's a tendency for the distribution of richness change to be slightly positive. So if anything, in these tundra ecosystems, we're starting to see a signal of increasing species richness. And I'll try and dive into a few examples later in a more wildlife context. And one of the other things we're working on in the lab is trying to understand the landscape context to biodiversity change. And so we've been setting up some protocols to look at the biodiversity in the regions around where we collect those long-term records, those ITEX plots, et cetera. And what we found there is that at the landscape scale, we're often detecting species that are not detected in the long-term monitoring at the plot scale. And this landscape scale is within 100 meters of those plots. And we found 24 different species that have never been detected inside the long-term monitoring plots that are present within that local environment. And so we're working on trying to incorporate that landscape perspective into the biodiversity analyses to give us a better understanding of what could happen in the future in terms of biodiversity change. So the take-home message of this part of the talk is, although plant composition is changing quite dramatically in these slow-growing tundra ecosystems, tundra biodiversity is only just starting to increase, perhaps, or the signal is quite weak as of now. And we may not be capturing all the change that's going on because of the way that we monitor these landscapes at smaller scales. So I wanted to add in a bit of a wildlife section to this talk. I know there's some folks in the Faculty of Forestry very keen on the wildlife side of Canadian ecosystems. And so let's have a think about how wildlife are responding to warming. So in the IPCC reports, there was quite a prominent role for wildlife in tundra and boreal ecosystems. And the major sort of pattern that I would say, I don't think they use this word in the reports, but it's starting to be used in the literature, and that word is borealization. So this idea that boreal species are moving into tundra ecosystems. And so animals such as moose, beaver, and songbirds are expanding their ranges northward into shrub tundra or upslopes in mountain regions. So one of the key examples of this are moose moving northwards. And one of our key lines of evidence for this doesn't come from scientific research at all. It comes from the observations of local people. Of course, the people living in the Arctic see these changes first, and they document these changes. So here's a quote from someone from the North Slope who said, "I've never seen any moose, or just a few, away from the willows," drawing this association between willows as really important habitat for moose. So that makes us think that as willows are increasing in these tundra ecosystems, that provides excellent habitat for moose, and so that would be a reason why they would be keen to move northward within the Western Arctic. And we also see not just changes in the ranges of species, but changes in the movement of species. So for example, migration patterns. And so one of those key pieces of evidence is to do with the timing of caribou migration in the Western Arctic. And so here's another quote from a community member. "You know, it's just a matter of timing of things. When everything being early or later spring, it depends on how far they make it before they start to calve." And now we can follow up on those observations with satellite records and of collared animals and the phenology of those landscapes and put this story together in a spatial context. And so I'm going to revisit the slide that we looked at earlier in the talk about how there are these early years like 2015 and these late years like 2018 in terms of plant phenology. And then we can look at where caribou are calving in those 2 years. So the early spring of 2015, and that island sitting up there, that's the field site Qikqtarjuaq. And we've got our little caribou icon. So the caribou migrate in this direction, and that's the calving ground there indicated in the green splodge in this year. But in the later year, the 2018 year, oops, that caribou is gone again. But what about this caribou? The caribou migrate, not as far. So you have the calving ground being on the Yukon North Slope, the right side of the map here, rather than on the Alaska North Slope. And that means that the caribou are moving closer to different communities in these early years versus late years. And if you sort of play through some of the phenology changes in your mind that might be going on in these systems, there's pretty strong potential implications for how caribou will move in the future and what that will mean for the livelihoods of local people. And there's other things that we're concerned about with wildlife in terms of climate change in the Arctic. And one of those things are rain on snow events in winter and spring, and how that impacts the ability of reindeer and caribou to reach their forage underneath the snowpack. So this is a nice photograph from 2007 in Fennoscandia, might be in Russia, where you have reindeer on top of the snow, and then you can see the snow layers created by these rain on snow events, preventing those reindeer from accessing forage below. And there's a really nice project led by the National Snow and Ice Data Center in the US, where they've compiled different lines of evidence for these rain on snow events around the Arctic. And you can click through and read about the different events, when they happened and what happened. So all of these changes in these Arctic ecosystems have really strong implications for the livelihoods of local people. And one of the real privileges of getting to work on Qikqtarjuaq for myself and my team is we get to interact with local people, the park rangers who I mentioned before, who were working alongside collecting data, conducting ecological monitoring, but also youth and elders from the communities of Aklavik and Inuvik and Old Crow as well, who get the opportunity to come out to the island to practice their traditional activities. And we have really wonderful discussions about the change that's going on there and what that means for them and their cultures. And so that was a feature that was very prominent again in the IPCC reports this time around. And that's a bit of a change from back in 2014. And I'll read a quote here. "Losses of ecosystems and their services has cascading and long-term impacts on people globally, but especially for Indigenous peoples and local communities." So the take home of this section of the talk is that boreal forest wildlife are moving northward with warming and the habitat change that's going on with that warming. And tundra wildlife are influencing more extreme events and changing plant phenology. And so there's potential for strong implications for food webs in these tundra ecosystems as all that change plays out. So towards the end of the talk here, I want to just make the point that most of what we've been talking about up until this point is the above ground perspective. And a lot of the really important change is going to be happening below ground in these ecosystems. And so that also featured in the IPCC reports, but maybe not as much as it should have, apart from talking about permafrost thaw in these systems and what that means for carbon dynamics for the planet as a whole. So one of the important things to remember in these high latitude ecosystems is that most of the biomass is below ground. So in tundra ecosystems, up to 80% of biomass is located below ground. And this is a photograph of myself and some of my students excavating a shrub. So you can see the above ground biomass. It's just about a meter in diameter, but the roots extended out for many meters and they were breaking off, so we couldn't exactly get the full picture. Just to give you a picture of what's really going on. The above ground is just the tip of the iceberg in these systems. And one of the questions that we have is what's going to happen to plant phenology as the climate warms, particularly in the Arctic. So will we see shifts with warming, as has been seen in a global meta-analysis that was published just in January? And will the shifts be different for different plant types, so woody species versus herbaceous species, and will it be different above and below ground? And this study suggested that there are stronger below ground responses with woody species and stronger above ground responses with the herbaceous species. So that's one of the questions that we're hoping to tackle with this new project called Tundra Time, where we're going to look at different hypotheses for how the tundra productivity could be responding both above and below ground. So the full timing of the growing season and how much biomass is being accumulated above and below ground. And one hypothesis is longer growing seasons are just leading to more biomass everywhere and in synchrony. Another hypothesis is we're just seeing this shift earlier in the growing season, but not necessarily an increase in the overall amount of growth and timing of growth across the season. And the final hypothesis is a sort of decoupling where we see shifts earlier above ground and shifts potentially later in terms of when the maximum growth is happening below ground. So how can we get at these questions? It's tricky, but what we've been working on is a below ground phenology protocol involving in-growth cores. So these are some of our volunteers for the protocol. We've got sites around the Arctic. And I think the site there, Mount Brew, is the UBC team installing their cores into the ground last summer. And so we'll be extracting these cores this summer and hopefully next summer as well, and looking at the timing of plant growth across these systems, and figuring out whether it's coupled or decoupled to what's happening above ground with our phenocams. And I just wanted to touch briefly on the boreal forest in this talk, because I've been talking a lot about the tundra. It's also an area that we want to explore more in future in my research group. And we've done a bit of work on that in the past, but we want to build on that now, because as you might guess, my research group's called Team Shrub. We're quite enamored with shrubs. And one of the big unknowns, I would say, in high latitude climate change research at the moment is what's happening to the boreal shrubs in the boreal forest. How are they responding to warming? So it's thought that carbon uptake in boreal forests by shrubs could be 10 to 20% of the carbon uptake. They're an important part of the understory canopy in different boreal forest environments. And they might be increasing as rapidly as shrubs in the tundra ecosystem, or they might be limited by soil moisture and other factors and not able to respond as much. But in general, in the IPCC reports, there was a nod to the boreal shrubs with this quote here: tundra and boreal forests are classified as particularly vulnerable to degradation and encroachment of woody shrubs. High confidence. So I think we need more research, though, because there's very, very few studies to back up that statement. So I wanted to end the talk thinking about the climate feedbacks from all of this change that we're seeing in terrestrial high latitude ecosystems. So this was a big focus of the IPCC reports, that the thawing of permafrost will weaken the natural land carbon sinks and increase the release of greenhouse gases. And one thing to remember about these high latitude ecosystems is that twice the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is stored in high latitude soils. And those soils are frozen, but very vulnerable to thaw. So this is again from the Keetark site, one of those permafrost thaw slumps. And you can see that thin layer of green, those plants that are protecting the carbon and permafrost below. But once you get a disturbance like this, thaw will happen and carbon will be released. And so why does that matter? And why do these changes in the Arctic matter for the planet as a whole? We always say in our media interviews, Arctic people, what stays in the Arctic does not, what happens in the Arctic, sorry, does not stay in the Arctic. And so, yeah, to make the point, looking at it at the global perspective, all of these red soils here are the ones that contain a lot of soil carbon and are vulnerable to thaw. And plants like shrubs are a really important part of these feedback mechanisms that are keeping soils cold or warming them up and leading to permafrost thaw. So if you get a more shrubby system in wintertime, that can allow snow to be trapped by the shrub canopies, creating a blanket over the soil surface. And that means that the really cold temperatures in winter can't penetrate down into the soil, so the permafrost temperatures warm up. And once the snow melts, those shrub stems stick up above the snowpack and darken the surface of the snow and allow the sun's heat to melt the snow and warm the system. And so we think over all of those processes, this sort of shrub albedo feedback will bring more warmth into the system and will facilitate permafrost thaw and ultimately carbon release. So these large scale climate feedbacks of vegetation change happening in the Arctic have the potential to accelerate climate change for the planet as a whole. So let's go back to our understanding of seasonality in the Arctic and think about that fact that it's the transitions from frozen to thawed that are at the heart of seasonality within the Arctic, how plants and wildlife frame their lives, but it's also at the heart of the climate change question. And when we're thinking about how much climate warming will the planet experience as a whole, it's this transition from frozen to thawed in the Arctic that's probably the sort of key piece of the story. So I wanted to just summarize broadly what's in the IPCC reports about warming and those impacts. And some of the topics that I'm going to mention here, I haven't really talked about in the rest of the talk, but I think they're worth a quick mention at the end here. So an important point is that a lot of the warming that's happening in these Arctic ecosystems is actually happening in the winter time. And those rain on snow events are happening often as we move between what we think of as winter into spring. And that leads to this lack of access for food for wildlife and can impact local people. But that also, the thawing of permafrost and the melting of sea ice and the earlier melt of snow influences movement for people, with their snow machines, et cetera, but also for wildlife in these systems. For example, caribou move along the Arctic coast on the sea ice when it's frozen, and they can't do that when it's melted. And then we talked in the talk a lot about that earlier start to plant growth and how that could be influencing things like wildlife migration and breeding. And then we talked about the faster growth of plants and that leading to changes in species composition and habitats. And we mentioned there the sort of longer snow-free period, which could lead to deeper permafrost thaw and loss of soil carbon stores. And finally, the sort of other side to the season is the return of ice and snow, and that can happen later nowadays than it used to, and that has really strong implications, particularly for transport and movement on things like ice roads in the Arctic for different Arctic communities, but also for wildlife. So here's a sort of little summary of what I think we will see in the next IPCC reports, or some of the questions that we need to answer before then. And that's getting a better handle on the rates of future Arctic warming, getting a much better understanding of the shifts in seasonality and plant phenology, particularly to do with the end of the growing season and the length of the growing season. What future wildlife habitats will be like as we see this vegetation change play out and potentially accelerate, and what the impacts of that will be for change in biodiversity and ecosystem functions. what the magnitudes of the climate feedbacks of vegetation change will be for things like permafrost carbon stores, and whether we're going to cross over any thresholds of change leading to tipping points in these systems. And finally, I think a really big piece of the picture is being more specific about what those impacts will be for livelihoods of Arctic peoples, and allowing those Arctic peoples to adapt to these dramatically changing conditions. A lot of change in the Arctic is really baked in at this point, so we do need to be thinking really proactively about adaptation. So I want to sort of end back where we started with this slide, and I think the only way forward to sort of get at those big picture questions that we'll be needing 6 years or so from now when we do the next set of IPCC reports, we're going to have to take a different approach to science, and I think that that approach involves really integrated collaboration with local people on the science end of things, sharing the data collection and the observations of change in the systems, on how we communicate science, and on bringing different perspectives into the whole picture. So I will end the talk there. Thank you very much for your attention, and all of Team Shrub is really hoping we can get back to the Arctic this summer to continue this work. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Isla, for that excellent talk, and just a great overview of what's happening in Arctic ecosystems. So a lot to pack in there. And so audience members, if you can post questions in the chat, or you could raise, I think you have the capacity to raise your hand, and then I can call on you to ask questions. And the first question that we have comes from Laura Coward, and she asks if there's any data of impact or effects of melting sea ice or effects on intertidal zones from these climate changes, opening up of water sooner, etc. Thank you. Amazing talk.
Excellent. A huge section of the report devoted to marine ecosystems, also coastal ecosystems. I decided not to delve in too deeply into that work in this talk, but just to give you some like little insights. I think one of the ecosystems or ecotones, if you will, that we're particularly concerned about disappearing, particularly from a seasonality perspective, are those ice edge ecosystems. So as we see a decrease in sea ice in these Arctic ecosystems in the summertime, there are specific communities in the ocean that are tied into being right at the ice edge. And if the ice edge is no longer there, how will those species respond? So that's one of the big questions. Another one coming to mind is the impact of shipping on the movement of marine invasive species. I think the marine invasive species side of the question is a lot bigger of a deal than the terrestrial one, because it's so much more easy for those species to establish through ballast water, et cetera. So there's a whole other side to the IPCC reports looking at those marine ecosystems and also freshwater ecosystems on land.
Great. Thanks for that. So our next question comes from Damien Asadi, and Damien asks if you could speak more about your team's collaboration with local peoples, or more on what you'd like to see happening with locals.
So we are working on, at the moment, trying to hire a youth member, so someone, I think they have to be a university student. So if anyone knows a great university student who's from the Western Arctic, we have a program open. It's funded by National Geographic Society. So that's the most concrete thing. I'm working on that right now. One of the things I'd really love to see, because I know there are so many engaged youth in these communities who are thinking about all these issues, is a way to really bring youth into the research perspective. And I'm thinking about that from all levels of youth. So I have some friends in the community of Aklavik who are 12 to 14 years old, and they're just beginning to build an understanding of climate change and the impacts on their systems. And they've been out with us in the field, and they have so much passion and energy, and they are interested in careers in science. So starting from that age, then high school youth, and then through to university, and providing opportunities for people to have science as a part of their lives without necessarily having to move to Southern universities or participate in the fully formal academic training. So thinking creatively about how we can enable local peoples to participate as scientists and data collectors and data interpreters, if that's a career path that they want, without necessarily them having to leave their communities. So those are some of the things I'm interested in tackling in the future. And then I think the big thing is just making sure we're getting the local perspectives, the traditional knowledge, but also the current observations of change that are going on into things like the IPCC reports and the academic literature in a meaningful way. And I think that's an ongoing sort of challenge for the whole academic community.
Yes, and I would say that those are challenges at lower latitudes as well that we're really hoping to address with some of the other research in Faculty of Forestry. So that's a great point. So Courtney Collins is ready to ask a question, and she was featured early in your talk. So go ahead, Courtney.
Hi, Isla. Great talk. Thank you so much. I was really actually curious about the shrub growth rate stuff that you showed and how that's like increasing directly because of warming, which totally makes sense. But I recently saw this paper that came out in PNAS this year earlier. I don't know if you saw it, but it's talking about how warming is actually reaching kind of a tipping point in the Arctic and reversing shrub recruitment. And so that might actually end up starting to like decrease shrubbiness in the tundra if the recruitment can't keep up with the growth. I mean, I know there's abiotic growth for sure, but I was just wondering kind of like, what were your thoughts on that? Are you seeing that signal in recruitment at your sites? And like, how should we think about that in terms of like shrubification? Thanks.
I did see the paper because I was a sort of friendly reviewer for the paper at an earlier stage, and they thought about incorporating some of my data, but it got too complicated. So basically, I'm not sure that signal is going on everywhere. We don't see that at our sites at the moment, but capturing recruitment is very difficult with these shrubs. So when the shrubs are seedlings, they are this big, quite tiny. They're dwarfed by the other plants. So you can't easily just do a survey and see the baby shrubs out there. So the way we get at recruitment is through dendroecology. So we can sort of estimate when a plant recruited in the past, but we don't have very good modern data necessarily. You have to wait for a decade or so for the plant to get big enough for you to be able to sample it. And then you have the precision on that date for recruitment is a bit weak. So it's quite hard to make the climate associations exactly at the sites that we've been able to do recruitment analyses for in the Yukon. We just see increasing recruitment over time. But I do think different parts of the Arctic have very different moisture statuses. A lot of the Western Arctic, the soils are very wet. I don't think that water is limiting most of the time, and though nutrients in general are often limiting in these Arctic ecosystems, I'm not sure that's holding back recruitment. But in other parts of the Arctic, you can have polar deserts like on Ellesmere Island, where Greg Henry's group works, where it could be quite dry in summer, and that could create a real barrier to continued increasing recruitment. One of the things maybe I should mention from the IPCC reports is this time around in the Working Group 1 reports, they made a much stronger statement about the Arctic having increased precipitation in future. Though the timing of when that precipitation happens, is it going to be snow in the winter or rain in the summer, et cetera? I think the feeling is that in general, we think there's going to be more rain in the summer. So that might reduce some of those moisture limitations in the drier sites.
So the chat is just absolutely full of questions as well as enthusiastic responses to your talk. So the next question comes from Mike, and he's asking how might caribou range shifts and shifting locations of shrub herbivory affect Arctic greening?
Great question. So we have a paper that I think it came out already. It's either accepted or published. You can view it online, trying to use growth rings to look at herbivory. And we did not find a particularly strong signal in that study for sites around the Arctic. But in certain places within the Arctic, you can see very strong herbivory signals. And one of the places would be northern Quebec. And so where the caribou herds are moving, they really eat down on the shrubs. And when they choose to move to different places, then you can get these sort of interesting dynamics where the shrubs get heavily hit, and then the caribou choose to go to different places. And you can see this kind of I don't know, greening and browning dynamics from space because of the movement of animals. I would say in general, it's quite hard for an herbivore, a large herbivore, to kill off a shrub plant because they're multi-stem, they're often quite big and they grow clonally. So it's more sort of a dieback signal in many cases. And to throw it out there for the insect loving part of the audience, another question is about cyclic insects, particularly in the European Arctic, and what impacts they might be having. And so, yeah, so there's definitely herbivory impacts. They're often quite spatially variable depending on the food webs in those systems. But my guess is overall, the shrubs are going to win out in the Arctic in their competition with herbivores.
So that's great. You touched on the entomological side there, and there's a question about that, but I think we only have time for one more question, and I'll give that to Kathy Martin, and she wants to know about the role of variability and extreme events, like the fact that it was 30 degrees Celsius for a week. And the extent to which those push systems to other states. And while I'm saying that that's probably the last question in this Q&A session, Isla, you may be willing to stay on to ask a few more questions if other people with questions want to hang on.
Sure thing. So definitely extreme events are a big part of the Arctic story, and I only touched on that a little bit in the talk with the rain on snow events in winter, which are created by these strong warming events. One of the really interesting things I think about, so I guess a question we could go back a step is like, why is the Arctic warming more than the rest of the planet? And one of the reasons, which is a complex region, is to do with this process, or many processes encapsulated in the term Arctic amplification. And one of those processes is the movement of air masses and ocean currents up into the Arctic, and then down into the, up into the Arctic in the Pacific side, down into the Atlantic side, and you get this, the big waves that control all of our northern hemisphere climate patterns. And you can get these warm air masses moving up over the Arctic. They can often displace cold air masses and bring them back south. So when we had the snows in Texas last year, that was bringing warm air into the Arctic as it was bringing cold air down. And that creates these extreme events. They can happen in the winter and they can happen in summer. When they happen in summer, you are very much dramatically increasing the fire weather situation. And so one of the big questions, particularly in tundra ecosystems, the boreal forest is very fire dependent. There's a strong fire cycle, but we're seeing an increased intensity of fires, an increased extent of area burned, and we're seeing fires reburn in the same areas, and that's changing the composition of the boreal forest. One of the open questions is how much is that going to happen in tundra ecosystems? As you get more shrubs, there's more flammable material, and we know from paleoecological records that there were more fires in tundra ecosystems of the past. So that is our expectation, is that fire is going to move into these tundra ecosystems, and that could have strong implications.
Well, with that, another example of just the connections to so many different fields of study and so many different questions. So a super interesting seminar, and I want to thank you so much for those of you who weren't on at the beginning. It is now 9 p.m. in Edinburgh, so many thanks to staying up and giving a late seminar, which is never easy. And yet there's more questions, so if you want to stay on and answer some of those, people can hang on. But otherwise, I hope to see all of you at our next Faculty of Forestry Research Seminar, and thank you for joining today.
Thanks everyone for coming.